at 0615 hours on October 12. Itenjobai. Captain Arthur Vance lay flat on his back, wiping grease and coral dust from his eyes. He was jammed tightly under the port wing of a P-38G Lightning at Dobadura airfield in the sweltering heat of New Guinea. Above him in the cramped cockpit sat Captain Elias Thorne, 24 years old, 42 combat missions, 4 confirmed aerial kills. A flight of 3 Japanese Mitsubishi Zeros was reported loitering in the heavy clouds above the Owen Stanley range. Thorne was about to take off to test a machine that actively wanted to kill him. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was an absolute engineering marvel. It possessed 2 supercharged Allison V12 engines. It boasted a top speed of over 400 miles per hour at 27,000 feet. It carried 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all concentrated tightly in the center nose. It was an airborne buzzsaw designed to shred enemy bomber formations. But it had one fatal problem. In a high-speed dive, the aircraft turned into a trap. The twin tails would vibrate violently. The nose would pitch down toward the earth. The flight controls would turn to solid concrete. Pilots called the terrifying phenomenon compressibility. Army Air Force doctrine was simple and rigid. Never exceed 350 indicated miles per hour in a steep descent. Use throttles to gently pull out. Don't fight the yoke. Thorne had tried that doctrine 3 times over the Solomon Sea. It hadn't worked. Between July and October, 1943, the 5th Air Force lost 14 Lightnings to unrecoverable terminal dives over the Pacific, 14 smoking craters etched deep into the dense jungle canopy, 14 empty cots in the sweltering canvas tents of the 475th Fighter Group. Thorne had watched his own wingman, Lieutenant Miller, auger straight into the Bismarck Sea just 3 weeks prior. Miller's final radio transmissions were just panicked breathing as he pulled desperately on a frozen stick. The official accident reports returning from headquarters all said the exact same blunt thing: pilot error. Compressibility was a terrifying ghost of physics. As the heavy, sleek fighter entered a steep dive, the air moving over the thickest part of the wing accelerated past the speed of sound. Shock waves formed precisely at Mach 0. Liushabar. This turbulent, supersonic wash slammed violently into the horizontal stabilizer. It completely killed the aerodynamic lift on the tail. Without rear lift, the aircraft immediately tucked its nose deeper toward the earth. The intense aerodynamic forces completely locked the control cables in place. Pulling back on the control yoke required an estimated 300 pounds of physical force. No human arm in the world could move it. The pilot simply became a terrified passenger inside a 14,000-pound aluminum coffin. The altimeter would unwind blindingly fast. The aircraft would accelerate past 500 miles per hour until it hit the ground. Vance studied the crude airflow charts sketched in his grease-stained maintenance logbook. The solution to the locked tail wasn't a bigger tail. It was a forward disruption, a small dive recovery flap, a physical wedge placed directly underneath the wing, just aft of the leading edge, deployed during a dive. It would artificially alter the pressure distribution. It would force the supersonic shockwave backward and restore clean, slow air to the tail surfaces. 2 days earlier, Vance had presented his crude, hand-drawn blueprints to the base engineering commander. The rejection was absolute. The aircraft was currently operating within specifications. Any unauthorized structural changes strictly violated factory tolerances. Modifying the crucial lift surfaces would instantly void the warranty and guarantee a severe court-martial for sabotage. There was absolutely no authorization for reckless field experiments. Lockheed's pristine wind tunnels were 400 miles away in Burbank, California. The brass flatly told him to fly the plane as built and wait for a factory solution. Vance didn't wait. At midnight, operating under strict blackout conditions, he and Thorne dragged a dim trouble light out to the muddy revetment. Vance scavenged a sheet of heavy-gauge duralumin from the rotting carcass of a wrecked B-25 bomber. He precisely cut 2 metal strips. They were exactly 30 inches long and 8 inches wide. He fashioned a rudimentary piano hinge. He sliced his thumb on the tin snips, leaving a smear of dark blood on the polished aluminum. He ignored it. He routed a crude manual actuator cable straight through the main wheel well. He riveted the makeshift flaps firmly beneath the outboard wing panels, setting them to deploy downward at a critical 30-degree angle. It took 4 hours and 15 minutes of bleeding knuckles in the tropical dark. The rigged flaps added exactly 18 pounds of physical tension to the cockpit control routing. It was a desperate, unauthorized, and highly illegal fix. Nobody noticed. The morning inspectors checked the Allison V12 oil seals, measured the tire pressure, and signed the daily flight sheet instead. What happened in the next 14 minutes would change the Pacific Air War forever. At 0616 hours, the twin Allison V12s roared to life. They kicked up a blinding storm of crushed white coral. Captain Elias Thorne released the mechanical brakes. The 14,000-pound fighter surged down the Marillion Strip at Dobadura. He lifted off heavily into the humid dawn. He pushed the throttles forward to 44 inches of manifold pressure. He began a long, spiraling climb. He passed 10,000 feet. He passed 20,000 feet. The air outside the unpressurized cockpit grew thin and violently cold. Frost formed on the frozen edges of the canopy glass. On the ground, Captain Arthur Vance stood near the empty dirt revetment. He held his grease-stained maintenance logbook. The blue-lined pages were a graveyard of failed doctrine. He read the handwritten entry for August 14. First Lieutenant David Calloway had engaged 3 zeros at 18,000 feet. Calloway pushed his nose down to chase. He radioed that his yoke felt completely mushy. He vanished into the deep waters of the Huon Gulf. The official headquarters summary read, "Pilot error." Vance flipped the worn page to September 2. Captain Thomas Greer had bounced a Nakajima bomber from 22,000 feet. Greer experienced a terrifying 14 seconds of control lag in the resulting dive. He barely recovered at 800 feet. The violent pullout permanently warped the main wing spars. The group inspector's final typewritten assessment blamed pilot error. Vance checked a third grim entry. September 28. Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes had been escorting bombers at 15,000 feet. He rolled over to pursue a fleeing enemy fighter. Hayes frantically reported his controls, felt dangerously mushy at 400 miles per hour. He never pulled out. His plane shattered against a shallow coral reef. The final crash report cited a complete loss of situational awareness. Pilot error. 3 dead men. 3 completely flawless airplanes. The brass refused to see the structural pattern. At 0626 hours, Thorne leveled off at exactly 27,000 feet. The jagged Owen Stanley Range looked like sharp green teeth far below. He took a deep breath of canned oxygen. He shoved the yoke firmly forward. The heavy nose dropped. Gravity immediately took hold. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly across the glass dial. 320 miles per hour. Sambai Basha. Subai Sansha. The heavy airframe began its familiar, violent shudder. The tail buffeted wildly as the airflow detached. He was quickly approaching Mach 0. Liu Shabar. The invisible sonic shockwave formed tightly over the thickest part of the wing. Instantly, the control yoke turned to solid concrete. The altimeter unwound in a terrifying blur. Asha 000 feet. Shabar 000 feet. Shawu 000 feet. The descent rate exceeded 8,000 feet per minute. The wind shrieked fiercely through the tiny gaps in the canopy framing. The intense vibration rattled Thorne's teeth. He pulled back with both arms, his muscles straining against the locked column. Nothing moved. He was trapped in a screaming aluminum cage. The green jungle canopy rushed up to meet him. At exactly 14,000 feet, Thorn stopped fighting the yoke. He reached down beside his left knee. He yanked the rigged actuator cable Vance had routed straight from the wheel well. It required exactly 18 pounds of physical tension. The improvised duralumin hinges screamed against the rushing air. The twin 30-inch metal strips dropped into the supersonic airstream beneath the wings. The aerodynamic effect was instantaneous. The small, crude flaps fractured the sonic shockwave. They violently kicked the turbulent air upward. Clean, dense airflow slammed back onto the rear horizontal stabilizer. The tail immediately bit hard into the atmosphere. The violent shaking stopped. The yoke suddenly broke free in Thorn's sweating hands. He pulled back hard on the controls. The heavy P-38 bottomed out violently at 500 feet. The massive stress popped a dozen rivets along the wing root. The G-forces pinned him fiercely to his seat. The blood drained rapidly from his head. He blacked out for 2 full seconds. When his vision finally cleared, the nose was pointed safely up at the bright blue sky. He was alive. Thorn circled back over the humid Dobodura airfield. He lowered the tricycle landing gear. He touched down at 0630 hours. The rubber tires squealed loudly on the crushed coral. He taxied back to Vance's position. The 14-minute flight was over. Thorn killed the twin engines. He slid back the heavy glass canopy. He looked down at his mechanic. He gave a single, slow thumbs up. The tiny thing had actually worked. It had defeated the ghost of compressibility. But surviving a controlled test was one thing. Proving it in a chaotic, unpredictable dogfight was another. As Vance reached for the daily flight inspection sheet to falsify the morning log, the base siren began a low, mechanical wail. A massive formation of Japanese Betty bombers had just crossed the northern coast. Ground crews scrambled. Engines coughed to life across the field. Thorn slammed his canopy shut. At 0631 hours on October 12, Iten Jobei Sushasan. The mechanical wail of the base siren drowned out the twin Allisons of Captain Elias Thorn's Lightning. Thorn did not shut down the engines. He slammed the heavy glass canopy shut and locked the metal latch. On the crushed coral of Dobodura airfield, Captain Arthur Vance grabbed the daily flight inspection sheet. He sprinted away from the spinning propellers. Thorn pushed the throttles forward. The heavy fighter surged instantly back onto the Marillinan strip. He took off into the humid morning sky without clearing the tower. A forward coastwatcher had just radioed the grim numbers. 18 Japanese Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers. 12 a 6M0 escorts. They were flying out of the stronghold at Rabaul. They were inbound to destroy the airfield. Thorn was alone in the air. The rest of the 475th Fighter Group was still scrambling frantically below him. Dozens of Lightnings were bottlenecked on the narrow dirt taxiways. He initiated a punishing climb. He pushed the manifold pressure to 44 inches. The Allison engines screamed in the thin air. He reached 24,000 feet, just as the enemy formation crossed the jagged coastline of the Solomon Sea. The Betty bombers flew in a tight V formation at 18,000 feet. The Zero escorts weaved methodically 4,000 feet above them. Thorn had the immediate altitude advantage. Standard Lightning doctrine dictated a strict hit-and-run approach. Dive shallow. Fire all weapons. Use superior mass to extend away. And climb back up. Never enter a steep, prolonged dive. Thorn rolled the heavy P-38 onto its back. He pulled the nose down sharply. He targeted the trailing bomber on the far left flank. He squeezed the trigger on the yoke. 4.50 caliber machine guns and 1.20 millimeter cannon roared simultaneously. A lethal stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds shredded the Betty's right-wing root. The bomber immediately vented thick black smoke and fell out of the formation. But Thorn had spent his kinetic energy. 20 escorts instantly peeled off from their high perch. They dropped directly onto his tail. The Zero was an incredibly nimble machine. It weighed just 6,000 pounds empty. It could easily turn inside the heavy Lightning. Thorn was trapped at 16. 000 feet. He had only one tactical option: gravity. He shoved the yoke hard forward. He initiated a near-vertical descent. The 2 zeros followed him down. The veteran Japanese pilots knew the fatal weakness of the P-38. They knew the heavy American fighter would soon compress, lock up, and plunge uncontrollably into the ocean. They just had to follow and watch the pilot die. The airspeed indicator needle raced clockwise across the dial. 350 miles per hour, 400 miles per hour, 440 miles per hour. Thorn crossed the invisible threshold. Mach 0, Leushabar. The thick supersonic shockwave slammed into the horizontal stabilizer. The nose tucked violently toward the water. The control yoke instantly turned to solid concrete in his grip. Thorn was locked in a terminal dive. The dark blue waters of the Huon Gulf rushed up to meet him at a terrifying rate. The Japanese pilots held their fire to conserve ammunition. The kill was already guaranteed by physics. At exactly 9,000 feet, Thorn reached down beside his left knee. He gripped the rigged steel cable. He pulled back with precisely 18 pounds of physical tension. Beneath the wings, the 230-inch duralumin flaps snapped downward into the raging slipstream. The aerodynamic effect was violent and immediate. The crude metal wedges shattered the supersonic wash. Dense, slow air slammed firmly back into the rear tail surfaces. The terrible shuddering stopped. The yoke broke loose in Thorn's sweating hands. He pulled back hard. The heavy fighter endured a massive 6G pullout. Thorn bottomed out at a terrifying 3,000 feet above the whitecaps. The immense structural strain popped 3 dozen rivets along the central fuselage. The aluminum skin groaned under the extreme load. The pursuing Zeros were completely caught off guard, lacking the sheer mass to sustain such a rapid descent. They had broken off their pursuit miles above. They watched in disbelief as the supposedly doomed lightning leveled out and accelerated away at 400 miles per hour. Thorn had survived a terminal combat dive. The unauthorized fix had just saved his life. At 0745 hours, Thorn landed the battered P-38 back at Dobodura. The rubber tires smoked heavily on the crushed coral runway. He taxied into the mud revetment. Vance was waiting. First Lieutenant Jack Macready, a 2-1-year-old pilot with the 432nd Squadron, walked over from the adjacent hardstand. Macready had witnessed the whole dogfight from 10,000 feet. Macready stared at Thorn. He asked a single, blunt question. He wanted to know how a dead man pulled out of a 400-mile-per-hour vertical drop. Thorn did not say a word. He simply pointed down at the outboard wing panels. Macready knelt in the humid mud. He ran his bare hand over the crude piano hinges and the scavenged duralumin strips. He saw the smears of Vance's dried blood still on the metal. Macready stood up. He looked directly at Vance. He said he had 3 combat missions scheduled for tomorrow. He said he wanted the exact same metal strips riveted to his airplane before midnight. Vance looked down at the official morning inspection sheet in his left hand. The paper strictly certified that all aircraft were operating perfectly within factory tolerances. Any unauthorized modifications would result in an immediate court-martial. Vance folded the sheet and shoved it deep into his pocket. He told Macready to find the rotting carcass of another wrecked B-25 bomber. He needed 60 inches of heavy-gauge duralumin and a sharp pair of tin snips. The secret was out. At 0200 hours on October 13, Etienne Jobai Sushasan, Captain Arthur Vance stood ankle-deep in the humid mud of Dobodura airfield. He held exactly 60 inches of heavy-gauge duralumin. First Lieutenant Jack Macready had demanded the illegal modification. Vance knew a single rigged airplane was a localized anomaly. 2 rigged airplanes constituted a deliberate conspiracy. If the base engineering inspector found unauthorized aerodynamic surfaces riveted to the wings, Vance would face an immediate general court-martial. He had to make the tiny thing invisible. He dragged a dim trouble light under the port wing of Macready's P-38. He initiated 3 precise mechanical steps. First, he sliced the salvaged duralumin into 3 0-inch strips using heavy tin snips. Second, he packed the crude piano hinges with thick axle grease to completely silence their movement. Third, he routed the manual actuator cable entirely blind. He shoved his bare arm deep into the cramped fuselage, feeding the steel wire behind the pilot's high-pressure oxygen tank. The sharp edge of the aluminum firewall caught his hand. It sliced his knuckles raw. He wrapped his bleeding fingers in an oily rag and kept pulling the wire. He attached the hidden cable to a salvaged cabin heater knob directly beneath the main instrument panel. The exterior concealment was a masterpiece of camouflage. When retracted, the duralumin flaps pulled perfectly flush against the lower wing skin. Vance painted the raw metal with standard Army Air Force olive drab. He then intentionally smeared the fresh paint with thick, black Allison engine oil. In the dim light of a hangar, they looked exactly like factory-standard access panels caked in normal runway grime. At 0600 hours, the group engineering inspector arrived at MacCready's revetment. He carried his metal clipboard. He shined a bright flashlight directly under the twin booms. He checked the landing gear struts. He ran his light over the oil-streaked panels. He saw nothing out of the ordinary. Vance handed him the daily flight inspection sheet. The inspector signed his name on the bottom line. The paperwork officially certified that the aircraft was operating perfectly within factory tolerances. On November 2, MacCready tested his hidden flaps over the Bismarck Sea. He engaged a highly maneuverable Nakajima Ki 43 Oscar at 20,000 feet. The Japanese pilot immediately executed a split S maneuver, plunging straight down to bait the heavy American fighter into a fatal dive. MacCready did not hesitate. He pushed his yoke forward. At Deutschbrezeche, 000 feet. The P-38 hit Mach 0. Leushabar. The supersonic shock wave formed. The yoke locked solid. MacCready simply reached under his instrument panel and pulled the salvaged heater knob with 18 pounds of force. The hidden panels snapped down. The nose pitched up instantly. MacCready leveled out at 400 miles per hour, slid directly behind the stunned Japanese pilot, and shredded the Oscar with a 1-second burst of 20mm cannon fire. MacCready returned to Dobodura and told his squadron mates. The secret spread like a localized wildfire. Vance's dirt revetment became a midnight chop shop. Captain Elias Thorne organized the logistics. Post-war unit diaries suggest mechanics quietly traded black market Australian whiskey to bomber crews for fresh sheets of B-25 scrap metal. By November 28. Iten Jobai Sushasan. 24. Lightnings in the 475th Fighter Group carried the illegal dive flaps. Vance and his exhausted ground crews logged 0 official structural modifications. They simply falsified the maintenance logs every single morning. They repeatedly stamped the paperwork as within spec. The numbers shifted with violent suddenness. Between October 15 and November 30, the 475th engaged in 42 major aerial dogfights. The heavily armed P-38S shot down 51 enemy aircraft. More importantly, the daily death loop was finally broken. During that 6-week window, the number of lightnings lost to unrecoverable high-speed terminal dives dropped to exactly 0. Pilots stopped fearing their own airplanes. They aggressively pursued fleeing Zeros into vertical drops. They utilized their massive weight advantage to build terrifying kinetic energy, strike their targets, and recover safely just above the ocean surface. The supposedly fatal flaw of the Lightning had been neutralized by a few scavenged hinges and an oil-stained lie. But the sudden shift in American tactics did not go unnoticed. 300 miles away, at the Imperial Japanese Navy stronghold of Rabaul, Commander Kenji Hori of the 201st Kokutai sat at a wooden desk. He reviewed the latest grim combat reports from his surviving pilots. The reports described an aerodynamic impossibility. The heavy twin-engine American fighters were no longer locking up. They were successfully following nimble Zeros into terminal dives and pulling out with devastating speed. It defied every known law of physics regarding the P-38 airframe. Hori understood the fundamental nature of the Pacific Air War. Superiority relied entirely on exploiting the enemy's mechanical weaknesses. If the Lightning could suddenly dive, the Japanese defensive strategy was obsolete. Hori ordered his veteran flight leaders to the briefing room. He issued a new, highly specific combat directive. He needed physical proof of the American secret. He ordered his pilots to isolate a diving P-38, shoot out its engines, and force it to crash-land intact on a Japanese-held beach. At 0815 hours on November 24, Itenjo by Sushisan, Commander Kenji Hori's directive became a violent reality over the Gazelle Peninsula. First Lieutenant Jack Macready was flying top cover at 22,000 feet. 6 A6M0s dropped silently from the blinding morning sun. They did not aim for the cockpit. They aimed precisely for his twin Allison engines. A perfectly timed burst of 7.7 millimeter machine gun fire shredded Macready's right engine cowling. Boiling glycol sprayed across his canopy glass. White smoke plumed thickly behind him. He immediately feathered the right propeller. He was now flying a crippled, asymmetrical brick. The Zeros did not finish him off. They throttled back and boxed him in. 2 on the left, 2 on the right, 2 high above. They were herding him north. They wanted to force the wounded Lightning down onto the hard-packed sand of a Japanese-held beach on New Britain. They wanted the machine intact. Macready refused to be a prisoner. He shoved the yoke hard forward. He entered a steep, one-engine dive toward the Solomon Sea. The airspeed dial spun rapidly, 340 miles per hour. Sanbaijoshu, Subaisansha. The crippled airframe vibrated with terrifying violence. At pace Brezecha, 000 feet. The supersonic shockwave formed over the wings. The yoke locked into solid concrete. The Japanese pilots followed closely. They watched intently. This was the exact phenomenon they had been ordered to observe. Macready reached under his main instrument panel. He yanked the salvaged cabin heater knob. The hidden actuator cable pulled with 18 pounds of tension. Beneath the wings, the 230-inch duralumin flaps snapped downward into the supersonic wash. The nose pitched up violently. Macready pulled out at a staggering 3,000 feet. The extreme G-force cracked his canopy framing. The trailing Japanese flight leader reacted purely on frustrated instinct. He fired a desperate, sweeping burst of 20-millimeter cannon fire as Macready pulled away. 2 explosive shells ripped directly through the Lightning's lower left wing root. Macready limped back across the water. At 1015 hours, he reached Dobodora airfield. His right engine was dead. His left wing was hanging by shredded aluminum spars. He lowered the tricycle gear manually. The heavy fighter hit the crushed coral runway hard. The rubber tires blew out instantly. The aircraft skidded for 800 feet, throwing a massive shower of white sparks and blinding coral dust. Captain Arthur Vance sprinted out of the mud revetment. He reached the smoking wreckage just as the crash trucks arrived. Group Commander Colonel Richard Blake arrived 60 seconds later. He was accompanied by the Chief Engineering Inspector. They walked slowly around the scorched aluminum carcass. The secret was completely exposed. The Japanese cannon fire had blown away a massive section of the lower left wing skin. The explosive heat had incinerated Vance's carefully applied olive-drab camouflage. The crude, grease-packed piano hinge was laid bare. The scavenged 30-inch duralumin flap was locked permanently in the 30-degree down position. The engineering inspector stared at the illegal metal wedge. He pulled the morning's daily flight inspection sheet from his metal clipboard. He looked at Vance's fresh signature. The official document swore the aircraft was operating perfectly within factory tolerances. The inspector turned to Colonel Blake. He stated flatly that this was gross structural sabotage. He declared that 24 Lightnings had been illegally altered in the dark. He demanded an immediate general court-martial for Captain Vance. The penalty for unauthorized aerodynamic modification was severe. Vance stood at rigid attention in the sweltering tropical heat. He did not say a word. He looked at the smoking metal. He waited for the military police to take his sidearm. Colonel Blake looked closely at the illegal flap. Then he looked up at the cockpit. First Lieutenant Jack Macready was climbing slowly down the aluminum ladder. He was bruised, covered in black oil, and completely alive. By all official doctrine, a pilot in a one-engine, 430 mile per hour terminal dive was a dead man. Blake looked back at the chief inspector. He asked for the squadron loss records for the past 6 weeks. The inspector replied the number was 0. The dilemma was absolute. The brass could arrest their best mechanic and ground the entire fighter group for violating safety protocols. Or they could admit that a mechanic with tin snips and salvaged bomber scrap had solved an aerodynamic crisis that baffled the world's greatest aviation engineers. Blake handed the falsified inspection sheet back to the inspector. He told him to lose it. Blake turned to Vance. He did not order an arrest. He ordered Vance to get his grease-stained notebook. He wanted every exact measurement. He wanted the hinge dimensions, the actuator cable routing, and the exact 30-degree deflection angle written down on official group letterhead. At 1,400 hours, a classified military teletype began clattering loudly in a heavily guarded communications room 400 miles away. At 1,401 hours on November 24, Ichenjo by Sushasan, Chief Aerodynamicist Robert Sterling tore the classified paper from the Lockheed teletype in Burbank, California. He stood exactly 400 miles away from the sweating, muddy jungle of Dobadura. He read the transmitted numbers: a 30-inch duralumin strip, an 8-inch width, a 30-degree deflection angle, and one 8-pound manual tension pull. Sterling did not recommend a general court-martial for the unauthorized field modification. He did not care about the voided warranties. Instead, he walked directly to the pristine Lockheed wind tunnel facility. He ordered his top engineers to fabricate a precision-scale model of the exact New Guinea fix. They placed the modified P-38 wing inside the massive steel testing chamber. They spun the heavy electric fans. They pushed the artificial wind speed to 450 miles per hour. Crossing Mach 0, Leushabar, the invisible supersonic shockwave formed perfectly over the thickest part of the wing, killing the rear lift. Then, they deployed the tiny dive flaps. The airflow data was absolute and instantaneous. The crude metal wedges violently fractured the shockwave. Clean, dense air reattached to the rear tail surfaces. The violent compressibility stall was completely neutralized. The aerodynamic puzzle that had killed dozens of test pilots and combat veterans had been solved by a mechanic with a pair of tin snips and a lie. The Lockheed factory machinery shifted immediately. By June 1944, the massive assembly lines in Burbank began rolling out the new P-38J25LO production block. The new aircraft did not feature scavenged bomber scrap or manual cabin heater knobs. They featured perfectly machined, electrically actuated dive recovery flaps. These factory modifications were flush-mounted under the outer wing panels. They deployed precisely in 3 seconds at the push of a cockpit button. Lockheed eventually built over 900 units of the J-25 and subsequent L models with the life-saving hardware permanently installed. The technical manuals were completely rewritten. The rigid official doctrine changed overnight. Pilots were no longer ordered to avoid the high-speed descent. They were instructed to actively use the dive flaps to maintain absolute pitch control at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. They could execute punishing 7G pullouts right off the deck. The heavy twin-engine fighter was finally unleashed. Back in the Southwest Pacific, the 475th Fighter Group received their new factory-modified Lightnings by late summer. First Lieutenant Jack Macready walked out to the Maryland Strip to inspect his fresh airplane. He knelt under the port wing. He pressed his bare hand against the smooth, factory-painted metal of the electrical dive flap. There were no rough piano hinges. There was no thick axle grease. It was perfectly legal. It was completely within spec. By the time the war ended in 1945, Captain Elias Thorne had survived 112 combat missions. He flew his factory-modified Lightning through dozens of screaming vertical dives over the Philippines. He never locked up again. The Lightning went on to become one of the most lethal weapons of the Pacific Air War. It accounted for more than 800 confirmed aerial victories. The daily death loop of terminal dives was permanently erased from the squadron loss records. The aircraft famous for raw speed no longer became a helpless coffin at speed. Captain Arthur Vance never received a medal for his midnight chop shop. The Army Air Force did not issue press releases celebrating mechanical sabotage. When the war ended, Vance packed his canvas duffel bag and went home. His grease-stained maintenance logbook, filled with falsified flight inspection sheets and crude airflow sketches, was packed into a standard wooden crate. It was shipped back to the United States and filed in a deep, forgotten archival vault. The official history books gave full credit to the brilliant engineers at Lockheed. It took 47 years for the full truth to surface. In 1990, an aviation historian was pulling forgotten logistics files at Maxwell Air Force Base. He opened a rotting cardboard box labeled 5th Air Force Maintenance 1943. He found Vance's blue-lined logbook. He found the blood-stained blueprints. He found a heavily folded flight inspection sheet from October 12. Attached to the back was a handwritten confession detailing exactly how many inches of B-25 bomber scrap it took to save a dying fighter plane. The historian published the findings. The quiet legacy of the New Guinea mechanics was finally cemented. A small flap turned panic dives into controlled escapes. A tiny, illegal piece of hardware preserved the lives of hundreds of experienced pilots. Sometimes, the difference between a fatal design flaw and absolute air superiority is just a desperate man willing to break the rules in the dark, to uncover more forgotten stories of the machines, the tactics, and the men who fought the Second World War. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below with which aircraft we should cover next.